Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking to you all about mental health in the Latinx community. I'm Dr. Eunice Humphrey, and I'll be sharing a little bit about myself. But I am a licensed clinical professional counselor. My background is I started off as a school counselor, and then I decided to have my own private practice. So I work with individual clients for a little bit with the techniques of mindfulness and person-centered. I've also been past president of the Maryland School Counselor Association. I have been involved with the Maryland Counseling Association and a lot of just different organizations helping out and advocating for mental health. So today the objectives are that participants will learn what common mental health concerns are in the Latinx community. Participants will also learn how to recognize mental health in Latinx clients. And finally, participants will learn at least 2 strategies when working with Latinx clients. So some norms, anytime we do talk about just different races or different ethnicities or different cultures, always be mindful, right? That you want to come with positive intention. You also want to come with that spirit or that desire to grow, that desire to learn, right? Respecting other people's point of views and just respecting different cultures, and also just being aware of your own biases, aware of your own different struggles. So again, throughout the presentation, I'll be sharing some of the just different stories and just different ways that we can always be culturally aware of everything that's going on. So again, a little bit more about who I am. I do identify as an immigrant, a Latina, a student, a leader, a lifelong learner, a cisgender. My pronouns are she and her. And so just being mindful also of that, right? And getting to know one another, also understanding how we identify and how we define ourselves, right? Not assuming anything. And so that is a little bit about who I am. I look forward to in the future learning more about you, learning more about who you are. And so towards the end of the presentation, you will have access to my contact information. You'll have access to my email and also my phone number. Please feel free to shoot me a text message or send me an email if you'd like to talk a little bit more on this topic. So, multicultural competence, the therapist must be self aware. Again, when we talk about self awareness, it's just really looking at yourself, right? Really looking at some of the biases that you may hold and that you may have. Understanding the client's worldview. Again, not understanding it from our perspective, but really understanding it from the client's perspective. Culturally appropriate treatment and treatment plans, especially with working with other cultures. You must take into consideration their cultural background. And I'll share a little bit about how I've worked with different Latinx families. And so one of the biggest things that I've done is I've worked with a lot of immigrant families. And so the goal has always been how to help with just being able to communicate with one another. And so I work with a lot of reunification cases where the parents left their child in the home country for maybe 5 to 10 years. And then when the child is now here, they were reunifying. And that has really been difficult for many Latinx families. And so I have been working with those families, and we work on communication. We work on again, getting to know one another. Some grief is also addressed during that time period. And when you think of grief, is that sense of loss. And so when you've been separated from somebody for that amount of time, then you do have this sense of loss. Again, being knowledgeable about other cultures and what they may bring to the counseling sessions. And so that's important. And then, of course, learning different skills, different tactics. And so today we are going to talk about mindfulness and also narrative therapy. And so those two have been some of my go-to, especially with working with Latinx families and Latinx community. So it's hectic. Life has been hectic, especially right now with everything that's going on. So we definitely know that, we're not getting enough sleep, and our sleep disorder has been changed due to COVID-19. And so some of us, we wake up at random times or we go to sleep at random times. So I put this here just because I also want, sometimes as counselors, we want to help and we want to do more and we want to make sure that our clients are doing well, but sometimes we forget ourselves. And so I know that we've had a lot of just different things happening, but one thing that you have to always do is do some self care. And so, even with our clients, we know that there's a stress right now. We know that there's a lot of just distractions and disengagement. And so, you have to recognize that not only within yourself, but also recognize it in your clients and see whether or not they're feeling any of these things. A lot of times we have the vocabulary to be able to voice that, to be able to say, I'm feeling stressed out, or overwhelmed, or I'm feeling really sad, or I'm not able to sleep at night, or I have anxiety, where our clients won't be able to do that. I know for the Latinx culture and community, oftentimes they'll say things like, I'm nervous or tengo nervios, right? It's just that sense of, I'm not comfortable with what's going on. I don't feel well, but I don't know the word. And a lot of times it is anxiety, anxiety about not knowing if you're going to be able to keep your job, not knowing it, depending on your legal status. If you're undocumented, you're oftentimes thinking, what if, ICE comes, or what if I, lose my job or get deported? All of those things. And even with right now, with the health conditions and COVID-19, we think about our Latinx clients, that sense of they don't have health insurance, right? So if you have your own company, if you have your construction company, or if you work as a house cleaner, you may not have health insurance. And so oftentimes that can also be a barrier to a lot of our Latinx families. So I want you to think about all of the different things that happen, as a consequence of a hectic lifestyle, or having all of those different life stressors. So we have two different pyramids here. You have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we most of us know about it, right? That's the psychological needs, safety needs, belonging and love, esteem, and then of course self-actualization. Well, there's another pyramid that was developed by Susan David, and what it is the emotional pyramids of needs. And when you look at that pyramid of needs, it really talks about a client's emotional needs. And so you look at gentle acceptance, where you can say, it is what it is. Like, we got to control our controllables. Even right now during this pandemic, we can't control nothing but ourselves, right? So that gentle acceptance of it is what it is, right? And then, of course, compassion, showing compassion for one another. Meet the client where they are, meet yourself where you are, address your own personal needs as well. Of course, establishing routines, create pockets of healthy routines, especially during this time. We need to have some routines. Connection. It has been great to have this form of connection and being able to talk to others through Zoom or Google Hangout or other platforms. FaceTiming has been so important, because one thing that we know is that we need to have connection. And then courage to reset, right? And that pretty much is stay open to tough emotions. They are expected. Identify what matters most to you, right? And be able to reset, be able to forgive yourself, be able to come back and help your client forgive themselves, be able to help your client process some of the emotions that they're feeling. And of course, the final one is wisdom, and of course courage, and then of course reset is also just being able to work towards some of the feelings, and be able to forgive yourself, like I said earlier. And of course wisdom, and then wisdom is life's beauty, is inseparable from is fragility, which means pretty much just being wise and knowing that life has many different beauties. And so one thing that I did here is that we're not stuck at home, we're safe at home. And so being able to kind of change the meaning of things, change our perspective, and really be able to become wiser during all of this. So I put those two because, especially with working with different families and the Latinx community, you will have to teach some of these things, right? It won't come naturally to a lot of us because for a lot of us, we want to go back to whatever norm was. So I want to go visit my family. I want to go, to the restaurant. I want to do all these other things. But with everything that's happening, we have to be mindful of those things. So cultural counseling, avoid stereotypes in counseling. Of course, there are many different stereotypes. With the Latinx family, is usually that stereotype of, oh, there's going to be many children, or they're not as invested in their child's life, or all of the different stereotypes that you've heard of the Latinx community. Please be mindful of those stereotypes, and they're not all real, and it's not fair to put people in these stereotypes, right? Racism and discrimination have a huge impact in mental health. So when we think about racism and discrimination, and I spoke a little bit about just thinking, am I going to be deported? Am I going to, how am I being looked at as an immigrant? Am I going to be, seen as undocumented and therefore seen as a criminal? And so when you think of racism and discrimination and how it impacts mental health, it brings a lot of anxiety, it brings a lot of depression, it brings a lot of esteem issues. So you tend to think of, I'm not better, or maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe I shouldn't be here, maybe I should go back, or just these different things that happen. Stigma is also something that we see in the Latinx community. I don't go to counseling because then you'll say I'm crazy. And so as a counselor, one of the things when I work with the families, I really try to make what they're going through normalized. So I normalize some of the feelings and some of the things that they're experiencing, just so that they takes away that stigma from going to counseling. And then, of course, there are multi-generational concerns. And what that means is pretty much a lot of our ancestors, my mom, my grandmother, my great grandmother, they didn't address some of the mental health conditions. And so I have had clients where they'll share with me, yeah, I had an aunt who heard voices and saw things and other people didn't see. And so we just ended up, putting her in a room and just telling her to stay in there. Or I've had many different families that say, my grandfather was an alcoholic. My father's an alcoholic. I mean, I just drink here and there, but it's not that bad. And they have maybe 3 or 4 DUIs. And so that multi-generational concern is real because what we see, we learn it. And so we do it. And so if the families have seen how mental health has been dealt with in their family or within their family dynamics, then of course that's how they're going to respond. That's how they're going to be more skeptical or more reserved to seeking help, because, or even saying, hey, I feel depressed, or I feel sad, or I feel angry, or I feel this anxiety. They're going to be more, again, they're not going to be able to say it just because they know how it's been dealt with in the past. So I wanted to define a couple of things. So Latinx, and the reason I use Latinx is because in the past, we've often said Latinos. When there's a group, let's say there's a group of 4 females and 1 male, automatically, because of that 1 male, it becomes Latinos versus Latinas. Right. And so what we saw is that, we wanted to be inclusive of all. And so then the term was Latinx. Spanish are people from Spain. And so if you're Spanish, it means that you're from Spain. And then also Spanish is a language. And so I'm not Spanish because I'm not a language. And I'm also not from Spain. So I'm from El Salvador. So I will be Latinx or I will be Hispanic, which is also another term that's used. And then, of course, there's bicultural, and bicultural means having 2 different cultures. And so somebody can identify as being bicultural. The word is undocumented, and then there's documented. And then, of course, in the past, what has been used is illegal or legal, and that's very offensive. And so, when you don't have documents to be in this country, then you're undocumented. When you have your documents to be in this country, then you are documented. It will be the appropriate word. So, if you have a permanent resident or you're a U.S. citizen and you were not born in this country, then you are documented. If you do not have the permanent resident or the U.S. citizenship, then you are undocumented. And then, of course, machismo, and I put that word in there for different reasons. But when you think about mental health in the Latinx community, the man tends to be very important in the household. And so, what we oftentimes see is that if the husband or the man in the household is open to counseling or says, yes, go, the family tends to follow suit. And so what we see is a lot of machismo or that male chauvinism and that male feeling like they're empowered. And so when I meet with families, I oftentimes ask to meet with the father figures. And because I need them to also understand the process, they play such a huge role in the healing process of their children, their wife, and even themselves. And so it's so important to include everybody in the counseling process with working with the Latinx community. So some of the common mental health concerns in the Latinx community are depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, especially if you have a client who has perhaps came to the country undocumented and had to cross the border. There's a lot of trauma that comes with that. And so the trauma of even leaving your country, having to do that migration, and then coming to a brand new country can cause a lot of like just different trauma and anxiety. There's, of course, a lot of suicidal ideation, and there's grief. Grief is seen throughout, again, for many different reasons. If it's because you left your family back at home, or if it's because you haven't seen your parents in such a long time and you're grieving that time that you didn't spend with them. And so these are the most common ones. Of course, there's also substance abuse and some other ones that kind of also can be considered. So oftentimes the Latinx community will hide their feelings, will ignore their feelings, will displace their feelings. So if you know that father that kind of comes home and is angry at everyone, versus saying what's really bothering them. Usually outside help is not sought until all family resources are exhausted. So I remember just different family members needing to seek somebody, but instead what they would do is they would just go to each other's house. And so you have your familia, your family to really kind of help you and pull you through some of your most difficult times. So seeking help or seeking an outsider is usually not something that most Latinx families do. And of course, the self medication. And when you think of self medication, you think of alcohol as being the number one choice. And it's that sense of getting drinking until you pass out and kind of just forget everything. And of course, what we know about alcohol is that it's a depressant. And so once you get out of that and you think of all the things you did while you were intoxicated, but then you also think of the problem is still there. And so it becomes like a revolving cycle. So, what are the behaviors to look for that indicate a client is having difficulty coping? And so, when you think of that question, you think of like behaviors, right? And that includes, being aggressive or drinking or, and being aggressive is not just, or abuse in the sense, is not just physical abuse, right? There's a lot of verbal abuse that takes place in the Latinx families. And so, from I should have never had you, or I should have left you back at home. I've seen a lot of just different things, a verbal abuse that takes place in a lot of the Latinx families that I've worked with. And so one of the things that I do is I help them communicate with one another what they're really feeling and where all of these emotions are coming from. So some clinical practice, of course, building rapport is so important. Engage in respectful, warm, and mutual introduction. Keep in mind that the client, especially the Latinx client, is going to see you as the expert. And so they're going to want you to almost fix me. You're the expert. Tell me what to do. And so one of the biggest things is to really build that rapport and engage and empower the Latinx family or the Latinx client, and knowing that they have the power within themselves to really get through some of the concerns that they want to address. Um, Keep in mind that the less acculturated Latinx client will see you as an authority figure again. Um, it becomes that sense of you're the expert and I'm just, just tell me what to do. Give a brief description of what counseling is and the role of each person. So it is so important to do some psychoeducation. That is, break it down, make sure that you explain it and explain it thoroughly so that the client understands what the expectations are. Explain confidentiality. Oftentimes, what happens in the counseling room, they'll go back and tell an auntie or tell a grandma, oh, do you know what we said? Or do you know what happened? And one thing that you want to make sure you do is that you explain the reason why confidentiality is so important, for the healing process, but for the growth process as well. And then have the client state their problems in their own words. Make sure that, again, it's like you want to empower your client to find it within themselves that they are able to deal with and address some of the concerns that they have and the reasons why they came to counseling. So, if needed, make sure that you have a translator. So, one of the things that I oftentimes do, if needed, I would talk in English to the student if the student preferred English, and then I would translate it for the parent. If the student was my client, I always want to keep in mind that you want to talk to your client in whatever language they feel comfortable. If you're not bilingual or Spanish speaking, then find a translator that can maybe help you with some of the bigger things like explaining confidentiality, explaining the clinical practice, and then work with your client. And then, if when needed, then bring a translator again. Determine the resources available to the client. Again, that just what are some of the resources? Are there anything else that you can provide? So if they're really having anxiety or stress over being undocumented, perhaps is getting them connected to a lawyer, an immigration lawyer, or if the family's having a hard time with accessing computers or accessing the internet or logging in, being able to connect them to just different community organizations that are able to help. Discuss the outcome of achieving their counseling goals for the individual, family, and the community. Like, what is the purpose? What are they going to get out of it? You want to be able to really discuss that with them and make them part of that process. Discuss the possible participation of family members and consider family therapy. So if needed, like I said earlier, I brought in the father figure into the sessions when needed. And so you want to build that relationship with your client where you can then say, hey, can I bring this person or can I bring that person? Assess the need for external sources. Again, that's food, shelter, employment. If you're able to assist with that, then make sure that that's something that you have and that you have access to. So some variables in counseling, keep in mind, familia or familismo, or the family unity is so important in the Latinx community. The family is something that you grow up with. Like there's this strength in having family and family support. And so you want to make sure that you talk about the family support, but then that you also start to set boundaries, because oftentimes you need that, especially if you are talking to a young client. So my high school clients, they usually are like, Dr. Humphrey, I don't want my mom to know because she's going to tell my aunt, or I don't want, my dad to know because he's going to call this person and all of El Salvador is going to know. And so knowing that, you want to always make sure that you explain the reasons and the purpose of not, breaking confidentiality. Respect is so important. Respeto. So the thing is that teaching boundary with the Latinx community is so important. I have most of my clients are Latinos or Latinx, and So one of the things when I was seeing clients in person, I would remember them coming into to my office space, and the greeting wouldn't, most of the times I don't necessarily greet with touch. I just usually say, "Hey, how's it going? Good to see you." But one client kind of came in to give the kiss on the cheek and to embrace with a hug. I had to really, sit that person down and kind of say, "Hey, um, we don't have to do that, and I respect you. I just want you to, understand the boundaries and the client counselor relationship." The other thing is I remember being in the counseling session, and the parent remembered my birthday, and brought me this gift, and it was this beautiful gift, and it was that sense of like, thanks, but I really can't accept it. And so really teaching that and making sure that it doesn't become like a personal, like I'm being ungrateful, but really just kind of explaining the reasons behind that, right? And just keeping making sure that it isn't personal. So I don't give my clients my phone number, my personal phone number. I don't follow them on social media. I don't, let them follow me on social media. And so all of that is important because you want to develop those boundaries. Trust is important, and pride. So knowing that pride is important in the Latinx community, one of the things you do want to work through is how do you help them deal with some of the concerns that are due to their pride. And so I've had many clients where we've had to really break down, if this didn't happen, or if you weren't so prideful and you let some stuff go, would things be different? And so again, it's a matter of helping them process some of these feelings. So, some interventions, of course, validation, being understood and reflective listening is so important. Trust, show that you care, watch for respectful boundaries, normalizing, making sure that the client doesn't feel like they're crazy, or that something is wrong with them, or that they're broken, or that they're not good enough. All of these things that sometimes you feel if you go to counseling. And then free expression. It is okay to feel the way this way, create a space where your client can express their feelings without being judged or criticized. Allow your space, your office to be that for your client, where they can really express freely. Some different strategies that have worked. Therapy is not the only tool. So there is breathing or respirar, and that's part of mindfulness, right? It's teaching the reasons why we breathe, right? It allows oxygen to our brain, and once oxygen is in your brain, and it does like calm you down and really allows you to think differently. Versus when you're in fight, flight, or freeze mode, it's difficult to kind of think clearly. Um, Harmonizing energy. So you want to teach them about just remaining calm even during difficult times. Uh, Herbal medicine. So I know that I got a phone call saying, "Hey, if you drink teas, that'll help you." And so a lot of families just have different little home remedies that they use. And so being respectful of that and being mindful that these different holistic medications have worked for them. And so allowing it, right, as long as it's not harmful or dangerous, allowing the families to kind of explore that spiritual healing. And that can be both through the pastor or through a priest, or it can also be through a spiritual doctor, where you get cleansings, or where they go and they really speak to somebody about just addressing some of the other needs that they may have. Sorry, excuse me. And then, of course, there are the worry dolls, and there's a picture of the worry dolls right there. And what the worry dolls do is that especially with younger children, your middle school and some high school students, what I've done in the past is I've used the worry doll where they can kind of share their worries to the doll, put it under their bed, and the doll will take the worries, right? It's that sense of giving away some of your worries to something. And so the worry dolls, proverbs and sayings. So I've had clients where I've talked to them and they'll say a proverb or a saying that they learned that's in Spanish, and that their grandma maybe has said to them, or that their mom said to them, and so you want to use some of the tools that they already bring. And so some of the proverbs and sayings are really strong, and then they represent something deeper. And so allowing the client to kind of process that. There's one that's no se puede tapar el sol con un dedo, right? And so what that says is you can't cover the sun with a finger. So if you look at the sun and you put your finger up and you know you only have one eye open, you can kind of block the sun. But if you open both eyes and you kind of step away, the sun is still there. And so is that the whole purpose of that saying is that you can't run away from your problems. You can't cover them, by just hiding. That you sometimes have to confront the sun, or you have to confront some of these big problems. And so, when you think about that and you think about those proverbs and those sayings, think about how they might help your client understand the purpose of counseling, the purpose of empowerment, the purpose of being able to not only practice mindfulness and healing and why counseling is so important. And so that's the proverbs and saying, and of course allowing them and giving them homework. So journaling works. Some of my young people prefer to draw or to write music or to write poems, and so allowing them to kind of express themselves in what ways they feel comfortable. Narrative therapy has been um, one that I have used, and it has really worked with a lot of my Latino clients. And so this is them kind of exploring their own overlapping issues, right? And externalizing them. So they're able to really voice and give me their stories. And then narrative therapy aims to identify and address the narratives that the client classifies as problematic and oppressive, to rewrite the narrative so that this is congruent with their needs and wants. So oftentimes if a young person comes and says, well, my family doesn't love me, I'm a burden. She already has a new husband, a new child. I'm just here as a burden. We explore that. I allow the student or the child or the client to really give me their narrative, to really give me what they're feeling. And then we kind of start classifying it as okay, so if this is the problem, and you feel like a burden, this is the problem. Who has said that you're a burden? How have they demonstrated or shown that you're a burden? And so when the client then kind of starts to rewrite their narrative, it becomes more of, my mom missed me, I missed her, we're here together, I can help out in the family, I can take care of my brothers and sister instead of being jealous of them, I can build a closer relationship with my mom, I can't undo the time that we didn't spend, but now that we're together, we can spend more time together. And it's that empowerment of rewriting their own narrative that really helps them through the process. So these are some of the steps. Identify the dominant story. The second step involves deconstructing the dominant story by focusing on parts of the story that contradict, parallel, or intertwine with each other, and then reauthoring the dominant story. The counselor aids clients to reauthor their stories by using the client's own words to help them rethink their relationship with the dominant story. Again, it's allowing them to reauthor, to rewrite their own narrative. And so I say this when working with any families, or specifically with the Latinx community, you have to have a lot of compassion, a lot of patience, but more than anything, with working with any family that is not that culturally you may not be comfortable with, or it may not be your own culture, is being aware of your own cultural biases, being aware that your goal as a clinician is to do no harm. And so you want to make sure that you really are helping your clients and empowering them to use some of the skills and techniques that you're going to be teaching them so that they can go out and use them and really overcome some of the life stressors that may be holding them down. So here are some of the resources. I'll also be sharing the PowerPoint, and I hope that you all get it. And again, let's keep in touch. That's my email. My phone number that you can text me is 240-770-1624. And again, I look forward to meeting you all at some point. I look forward to continuing this conversation, and thank you.